Imagine, for a moment, the fall of Rome. What do you see? You probably see the sky choked with black smoke. You see the Visigoths sacking the city, marble columns toppling, and the desperate screams of a civilization meeting its violent end at the tip of a barbarian sword. It is the Hollywood ending we are all familiar with. It's dramatic, it's visceral, but it is also incomplete. The truth is, by the time the barbarians kicked down the gates, the Rome behind them was already a ghost. The legions didn't just collapse because they were out, they collapsed because they couldn't be paid. The markets didn't empty because of siege, they emptied because the money used to buy bread had become worthless. Rome wasn't murdered, Rome committed suicide. It died from a slow-acting poison administered by its own leaders, drop by drop, over centuries. That poison was currency debasement. And the most terrifying part of this story isn't that it happened 2,000 years ago. It's that, if you look at the global economy today, you will see we are walking the exact same path, step for step, into the same abyss. The golden age of confidence. To understand the tragedy, we have to understand what was lost. Travel back to the height of the Pax Romana. For nearly 2 centuries, the known world was held together not just by Roman law, but by the Roman silver, denarius. This small coin was the dollar of antiquity. It was the lifeblood of trade from the misty hills of Scotland to the deserts of Syria. When a Roman soldier received his pay, or a merchant in Alexandria sold a shipment of grain, they weren't just exchanging metal discs, they were exchanging trust. The denarius was struck from nearly pure silver, about 95% purity during the time of Emperor Augustus. It was heavy, it was real, it represented a promise that the empire was stable, and that your labor was stored in something that wouldn't rot or fade. This stability created the greatest free trade zone the world had ever seen. A man could travel across 3 continents using a single currency, confident that his wealth was secure. This financial backbone allowed Rome to build the aqueducts, the Colosseum, and the roads that we still marvel at today. It proved that sound money is the foundation of a sound civilization. The slippery slope of greed. But empires, like modern governments, have a fatal flaw. They are addicted to spending money they do not have. As the centuries wore on, the costs of maintaining the world's superpower began to mount. The legions needed higher wages to stay loyal. The massive bureaucracy needed funding. Public games and festivals to keep the mob happy became more extravagant. And, of course, the emperors themselves desired palaces that rivaled the gods. Rome faced a simple mathematical problem. They were spending more than they were collecting in taxes. Now, a responsible government would have cut spending or raised taxes. But raising taxes is dangerous. It makes the people angry, and angry people overthrow emperors. So, the Roman leadership chose the path of least resistance. They chose the lie. It started subtly. In the reign of Nero, the man famous for fiddling while Rome burned, the treasury began to tamper with the coins. They slightly reduced the size of the denarius and trimmed the silver purity. It was barely noticeable at first. Just a shaving here, a percentage point there. The government took the leftover silver and minted more coins to pay their debts. That had felt like magic. They had created free money out of thin air, but they had uncorked a demon that they could never put back in the bottle. The great deception. Once the precedent was set, the slide into financial oblivion accelerated. Succeeding emperors looked at the treasury and realized they could do the same thing, but on a larger scale. By the time of Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 200s, the silver content had crashed to around 50%, but the real death blow came 50 years later. Under the reign of Gallienus, the denarius had become a fraud. It contained less than 5% silver. Archaeologists have found these coins. They are pitiful things. They were essentially slugs of bronze or copper, dipped in a thin wash of silver to make them look shiny for a few weeks. But as soon as the coin passed through a few hands, the silver rubbed off, revealing the cheap base metal underneath. Imagine the psychological shock of that. You are a Roman citizen. You work hard all week, and you are paid in coins that literally rust in your pocket. The market reacted exactly as you would expect. If the money is half as good, the merchant demands twice as much. Prices exploded. This wasn't just inflation in the way we complain about gas prices rising by a few cents. This was the destruction of the social contract. Wheat, wine, oil, clothing, the cost of living soared into the stratosphere. Soldiers, realizing their pay was worthless, demanded raises, forcing the emperors to print even more bad money to pay them, fueling the fire even further. It was a doom loop. The government was trying to outrun the consequences of its own theft. The crisis of the 3rd century. This financial rot triggered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a period of absolute anarchy. In a span of just 50 years, Rome saw at least 26 claimants to the throne. Emperors were assassinated with clockwork regularity, often by their own troops who were angry that their bribed wages bought nothing. Society began to fracture. Why plant crops if the money you get for them can't buy tools? Why trade with a neighbor if you can't trust the currency settlement? The economy regressed. Sophisticated trade networks broke down. People left the cities and moved to the countryside to survive on subsistence farming. The complex, interconnected economy of the greatest empire on earth was reduced to people bartering chickens for shoes because the medium of exchange had died. The hubris of control. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, Emperor Diocletian seized power in 284 AD. He was a strong man, a ruthless organizer, and he decided he could command the economy just like he commanded an army. He looked at the soaring prices and decided that the problem wasn't the worthless money, it was greedy. Merchants, does that sound familiar to modern ears? So, in 301 AD, he issued the infamous edict on maximum prices. It was a massive list of price controls. He set a fixed price for wheat, for beer, for meat, even for the wages of a stonemason or a teacher. The penalty for violating these prices was death. It was the ultimate test of government force against economic reality, and reality won. Merchants simply stopped selling. If you force a baker to sell bread for less than the cost of the flour, he will close his shop. Goods disappeared from the shelves. Black markets exploded, where real trade happened in secret at real prices. Diocletian's laws, written in blood, failed to lower the price of a single loaf of bread. He eventually abdicated, and the laws were ignored, leaving behind a shattered economy. By the time Constantine introduced the slasa, pure gold coin, to try and stabilize the East, the West was already too far gone. The middle class had been wiped out. The loyalty of the people had evaporated. When the Germanic tribes finally marched in, many Romans barely lifted a finger to stop them. Why fight to save a system that had already robbed you of everything? The mirror of history now. You might be thinking, that's a tragic story, but we use sophisticated digital banking and central banks now. We are smarter than the Romans, are we? The terrifying reality is that the destruction of money is not an ancient phenomenon. It is a recurring pattern of human history. The technology changes, but the psychology does not. Fast forward to 1921. The Weimar Republic in Germany. Saddled with war debt, the government turned to the printing press. They believed they could print their way out of trouble. In less than 2 years, the German mark went from trading for TO1 against the dollar to 4 trillion-2-1. We have all seen the photos. Children flying kites made of banknotes because the paper was worth less than a toy. People burning bundles of cash in stoves because it was cheaper than buying wood. The most educated, industrial nation in Europe reduced its middle class to beggars in months. And in that vacuum of despair, political extremism took root, leading directly to the rise of the Nazis. Jump to Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Same story. A government desperate to pay bills prints money. Inflation hits 89 sextillion%. A starving billionaire becomes a common tragedy. The modern empire, but those are extreme examples. Right, it couldn't happen in the stable West. Consider this. In 1971, the United States severed the final link between the dollar and gold. For the first time, the entire global economy began running on fiat currency money that has value only because the government says it does. Since that day, the supply of money has exploded. The US national debt has moved from manageable billions to incomprehensible trillions. And just like the Roman emperors, modern politicians have realized that printing money is easier than taxing citizens. They call it quantitative easing. They call it stimulus. They call it liquidity injections. But let's call it what it really is. Debasement. That is the same copper clipping scam, just done with computers instead of smelters. You feel it every time you go to the grocery store. They tell you inflation is 3% or 5%, but you know your grocery bill has doubled. You know that a house your parents bought on a single factory salary is now out of reach for 2 college-educated professionals. That isn't growth. That is your money dying. That is the silver wash rubbing off the coin to reveal the base metal underneath. The government tells us the economy is strong because the stock market is high. but the stock market is priced in dollars that are worth less every single year. The verdict so. What is the lesson here? Why does the ghost of Rome matter to you, sitting here today? It matters because history is the only map we have. Rome teaches us that currency collapse is not an event, it is a process. It happens slowly, creating a false sense of security, and then it happens suddenly, wiping out those who are unprepared. It teaches us that you cannot trust a government to protect the value of your labor. Their incentives are aligned with spending, not saving. The Romans who survived the collapse were the ones who didn't hold their wealth in the emperor's debased coins. They held land, they held gold, they held productive businesses, they owned things that were real, things that could not be printed into oblivion by a desperate bureaucrat. The final warning, the fall of Rome, was a tragedy. But for us, it is a warning siren wailing across the centuries. Financial systems are fragile. Trust is hard to build and easy to destroy. The barbarians are not always at the gate. Sometimes the greatest threat to your future is the printing press inside the capital. Don't wait for the smoke to appear on the horizon to realize the empire is burning. By then, it's already too late. If you want to understand how to protect yourself when history repeats itself, make sure you are subscribed. We are going to keep digging for the truth that the history books try to hide.